What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video we are hopping into week 15 must start running backs for the 2022 fantasy football season. It is playoff time. It is finally here, and in today's video we will be going over running backs that you absolutely cannot afford to not have in your starting lineup as we approach the first week of the fantasy playoffs. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. And of course, let me know what running backs are you starting in the first round of the fantasy playoffs as we approach week 15 of the 2022 fantasy football season. With that being said, let's hop into today's video. All right, number one overall, we've got Christian McCaffrey of the San Francisco 49ers. If you are a CMC owner, you are starting him regardless, but we've just got to point out the incredible matchup against the Seattle Seahawks here in week 15, the second worst team in the entire NFL against opposing running backs from a fantasy perspective. Christian McCaffrey should have a monster day, considering in week 14 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, one of the best teams in the league against the run from a fantasy perspective. He had 29.3 fantasy points, 119 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and 2 receptions for 34 receiving yards. CMC comes in as your RB3 so far on the season, and in the first round of the playoffs, there's no reason whatsoever to doubt McCaffrey and himself having a absolutely stellar performance in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. Next up, we've got King Henry himself, your RB4 so far on the season. He'll be facing the Chargers, the 4th worst team in the league against opposing running backs from a fantasy perspective. Henry had 20.5 fantasy points in week 14, 121 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and 3 receptions for 34 receiving yards. It's worth pointing out that in the past couple of weeks, the Chargers defense has looked a little bit better than it did earlier in the season, but regardless, if you own Derrick Henry, you were starting him anyways. And at the end of the day, on the season as a whole, this Chargers unit has not played well against the running back position. Henry is the heart and soul of the Tennessee Titans offense. I expect a big outing for him in week 15, and I mean, there's really no way he won't make next week's list as he faces the Texans in week 16 before getting Dallas in week 17, a little bit of a steeper matchup. But overall, Derrick Henry is going to be a league winner throughout the playoffs, and we're absolutely firing him up here in week 15. Next up on the list, we've got Dalvin Cook of the Minnesota Vikings, your RB12 so far on the season. Maybe not as much as a no-brainer as the first 2 running backs on this list, but Cook will get the Indianapolis Colts here in week 15, the 7th worst team in the league against opposing running backs from a fantasy perspective. Cook had just 8.6 fantasy points in week 14 against the Detroit Lions in a game script that heavily favored the passing attack and not the running attack for the Vikings. Just 23 yards on the ground. He did score a touchdown and have 1 reception in that matchup. But here in week 15, in a game that should have a game script that favors the running back position and the Vikings rushing attack, I expect Cook to have a much better performance and to hold a much higher ceiling in a really good matchup. I think Cook is a smash play here in the first rounds of the fantasy playoffs. All right, let's talk about Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott here, absolutely lighting up the fantasy football community from the running back position. Pollard is your RB7 overall so far on the season. Zeke is your RB21 overall on the season, but he has missed 2 games on the year and kind of struggled in the first 2 weeks of the year. Overall, both of these running backs are essentially going to be must starts on a weekly basis, even though they draw tougher matchups in week 16 and 17. But here in week 15, they will face the Jacksonville Jaguars, the 9th worst team in all of fantasy football against the running back position. In week 14 against the Texans, Pollard had 42 yards on the ground, a touchdown on the ground, 4 receptions for 20 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Ezekiel Elliott had 17.1 fantasy points, 62 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and 3 receptions for 19 receiving yards. When we look at the season as a whole, Tony Pollard has hit double-digit fantasy points in every game this year except for 4 matchups. Ezekiel Elliott, on the other hand, has hit double digits in every game this year if we don't include the 2 games he was hurt, except for 3 total matchups. Zeke has had 15 or more fantasy points every week since week 6. And on the other hand, since week 7 of the season, Tony Pollard has had 12 or more fantasy points in every single matchup except for week 12 against the Giants. The Cowboys unit relies on the run game and on the defensive side of the football. This is a good matchup for both Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott. I think they are absolute locks in your starting lineups as we approach week 15. All right, we've got another running back tandem for you guys. Isaiah Pacheco and JERRICK McKinnon will square up against the Houston Texans in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. The worst team in the entire league from a fantasy perspective against the running back position. Doesn't even feel fair because both of these guys have been balling out in the last 2 weeks. McKinnon has had 14 or more fantasy points in his last 2 matchups. He had 9 targets last week, 7 receptions, 112 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. He also had a receiving touchdown in week 13 against the Cincinnati Bengals. I want to start with McKinnon because I will say I'm a little bit more worried about starting JERRICK McKinnon because I could see this game script against the Houston Texans being a game script where the Chiefs don't need to throw the football as much or keep the game nearly as competitive. When we look at the last 2 weeks, that game against the Bengals and that game against the Broncos ended up being very competitive game scripts where the Chiefs needed to throw the football. But with all that being said, I said the same thing last week about a lot of the Cowboys receiving options, and the Texans made that a very competitive game, and this is a game that is at home for the Houston Texans. But at the end of the day, even if I'm a little bit worried about McKinnon, I think he's an extremely strong flex as we approach the week. And Isaiah Pacheco, on the other hand, I mean, really, when we look at this matchup against the Texans, Isaiah Pacheco should have a monster day. At least 66 or more rushing yards in every game since week 10 for Isaiah Pacheco. He has 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games, 12.3 fantasy points against the Broncos in week 14, 70 yards on the ground, 3 receptions for 23 receiving yards, double digits in terms of fantasy scoring in his last 4 games in full PPR scoring formats. He has just been really consistent essentially since he's become the running back 1 for the Kansas City Chiefs, and this should be a game where they absolutely feed Pacheco. He could be a round 1 winner for you guys as we move into week 15. Next up, we've got Miles Sanders of the Philadelphia Eagles going up against the Chicago Bears, the 6th worst team in the league against the running back position from a fantasy perspective. He had 28.5 fantasy points in week 14 against the Giants, 144 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns and 1 reception. He's our RB9 so far on the season. He's having a very good year. He's been pretty consistent overall on the season. Just 4 games this year where he hit single digit fantasy performances. Every other matchup this year he's hit double digits. Coming off of his 3rd best fantasy performance, I really like him against the Chicago Bears this week. I do think this game will stay relatively competitive with Justin Fields on the other side of things, but at the end of the day, this Eagles team is absolutely on fire. And the good thing for Miles Sanders is they are consistently in game scripts where Miles Sanders and Kenneth Gainwell need to kind of pack away the game, so to speak, and kind of get rid of some of that clock. So I think that Miles Sanders, you know, this is a good game script for him. He's playing very good football, and the matchup against the Chicago Bears is absolutely beautiful. Miles Sanders is a must-start running back for me as we approach week 15 of the season. Last but not least, we've got J.K. Dobbins of the Ravens going up against the Cleveland Browns, the 3rd worst team in all of fantasy football against the running back position. Dobbins looked really good in his second return from injury on the season. 18 fantasy points in week 14 against the Pittsburgh Steelers, 120 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown. And the Browns are far worse than the Steelers at stopping the running back position. So I expect Dobbins to have a big day, especially with the fact that Lamar Jackson is more than likely going to be out in this matchup. And even if Jackson is not out, it's still a very good matchup for Dobbins. We know that the Ravens love to run the football and they don't have a lot of receiving threats overall, so Dobbins should be in line for a good amount of volume. You guys know throughout the season I've had a lot of trust issues when it comes to the Baltimore Ravens backfield, and it is worth noting that Gus Edwards had 13 rushing attempts last week as well and 66 yards on the ground. Dobbins definitely had the better day overall and the better fantasy day, but I won't be surprised if Edwards is slightly involved in this game like we saw last week as well. So Edwards, if you guys are desperate, is worth a look just due to the matchup, but ultimately I think that J.K. Dobbins is an extremely great play moving into the first round of the playoffs. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you are new to the channel. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. And let me know in the comments, did you guys make the fantasy playoffs this year? Who are you starting at any position? And most importantly, what running backs are you starting in the first round of the playoffs? I want to do anything I can to help you guys get a victory and ultimately win your fantasy championship this year. And be sure to look out for our next fantasy Q&A live stream. We would love to have you guys there. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.